Train the muscles, not the joints.
Welcome back to Natural Gallant Bodybuilding Mountain. And today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about a question that was just asked in the comments by a really nice dude. He asked me this question. He said, Jason, should you squeeze the reps or should you just concentrate in getting from point A to point B in an exercise? Now, my short answer to this is both, because there's a time and place for each technique, and sometimes if you apply a technique in the wrong area, it may not necessarily harm you, but at the same time not necessarily give you the best results. So as I've talked about lots of times, when it comes down to natural bodybuilding, you want to gain strength and then you rep out with that strength. And then of course you also do some isolation type movements from time to time to make sure that you're hitting the muscles that you want to hit. Because sometimes compounds, no matter how you adjust the form, they do have a tendency to include perhaps other muscle groups that you're not interested in hitting quite so aggressively. Perhaps, say, just as a standard example, is during bench press, you want the chest to get the majority of the stress, but we all know some people, they get more delt development from bench presses than they would want. They'd like to have a little bit more chest development. But instead of getting obsessive compulsive and going crazy over every single compound, trying to isolate during compounds, I find it best to understand that a compound will never totally isolate one muscle group. That's why it's a compound. You're including multiple joints in the exercise, and that's really the blessing of it. You are stimulating multiple muscle groups, not just one, although one may be stimulated in majority compared to the others. So what I do in this case is when I'm using a compound and using heavier weight, I will then concentrate more on getting from point A to point B in the strategic range of motion I wish to use that seems to hit the muscle group that I want to hit in majority. So if I'm doing my constant tension reps that I get trolled for all the time, but when I'm doing these constant tension reps, I'm hitting or feeling the tension on a certain area that I want to stress the most. So when I lock out, I may notice that my delts start to hit failure first, or my triceps during bench presses. Well, that's why you will see me use these shorter type reps within a certain range of motion, because that's where I feel the majority of the stress on the chest. Now, when I'm using lighter weight, one could argue that you can get more creative in your reps as far as, let's just say there's more forgiveness or latitude when it comes down to doing something that's a little bit more dangerous. So I never recommend flaring the elbows on bench press, but we all know the pros back in the day, they used to touch their neck with the bar or come higher up on the chest with the bar in order to isolate their pecs when they're using lighter weights. This is a very dangerous technique to use when you're using heavier weight, but with lighter weight, you could probably get away with, like I said, some movements that are not necessarily as safe when using heavyweight. So mostly what I do when I'm using a compound to isolate a muscle is I use the range of motion in which I feel the tension is distributed mostly on that muscle I want to hit. But do I concentrate on squeezing the muscle all the way through? I never really found that I got much result from that during my compounds. If anything, I felt what was most efficient was to go up in strength, and as I added more poundage and as I got stronger, I naturally started to put on muscle. Now, once I go to the isolation type of exercises, or even really, really light exercise type training, I may notice that because I'm doing more of an endurance type of workout, that a certain amount of isometric influence can come into play, because you're really just trying to exhaust the muscle. You're not necessarily trying to hit those fast twitch fibers as much as you're trying to hit those endurance fibers. So when you're doing that, it would stand to reason or make sense that perhaps a little bit of the squeezing of the muscle, or sometimes static holds and that sort of thing, could influence some sort of muscular development in those muscle fibers. So say I'm doing really light dumbbell presses, I may squeeze the muscles at the top and come down really slowly, or control the weight. I may mess around even with rep speed. I may play around with it just to see what feels good for that day, what feels like I'm pumping blood into that area and getting the greatest burn or pumpy and lumpy feeling from it, right? That's the nice part about using lighter weights. You can play around, you can get a little bit more creative, and at the same time, you're really just trying to exhaust the endurance fibers. So if you're doing the heavy work, once you start doing the light work, they become synergistic, right? It's not like you're just doing these squeeze reps or these ego type of pose in the mirror type repetitions, right? You are using the strength and progressive overload type of techniques as well. I don't usually call just gaining strength progressive overload, but whatever, I guess that's what it is. But the time that I would say that squeezing the muscle might affect you in a positive way is that if it helps you make sure that that one muscle group is hitting failure. So during isolations, perhaps you're doing like tricep press downs or maybe even skull crushers, and you notice you start to bring your lat into the movement, or maybe you start to swing the movement a bit or whatever, and you notice that maybe your tricep is not hitting absolute failure. A good way to make sure that it is to start squeezing those reps out and really isolate that contraction. And from doing so, you may notice that that muscle gets a more obvious type of pump and a more obvious type of muscular fatigue in it. And therefore, you're ensuring that you're not recruiting other muscles in the process. But yeah, the only time that you'll see me really get creative when it comes down to how I'm squeezing the muscle or what I'm doing is usually during isolation movements, because at that point you're trying to exhaust in any way, shape, or form. Like for instance, even today on chest flies, I wasn't squeezing at the top when I was doing chest flies, because as you can see, as I bring the arms closer together and then gravity goes this way when I'm laying down on my back, there's going to be less tension up here. So there's a point of diminishing return once my arms get above my shoulders. So I found that sometimes short pumping motions in the stretch state were actually better. And one could say, oh wow, that's not a squeeze, why would that work? Well, because I'm keeping the tension on the muscle in the stretch state. And I'll make a video about this, but that is an excellent way to make sure that you're recruiting that muscle group and then not wasting the engagement of all the other muscle groups in the process when you're coming up. Because I start to hit a lot more front delt as I'm coming more forward with my arms or more up with my arms during a fly. Now that might be different for you, but for myself, I find you have to find that perfect little sweet spot in the repetition. And sometimes it'll be squeezing, sometimes it will be you using reps that are shorter range in the stretch portion. And the time to experiment is when you're using lighter weight with isolations, and that's the great time to do this. But when it comes down to the heavier compounds, I do definitely concentrate just on going from point A to point B in the safest possible way and making sure the groove is correct and that I'm all power, right? I'm just keeping the body tight, lifting the weight for as many reps as I can, and distributing that stress all over the body. And then from there, and then of course, assuming that I have the right technique for me, the right range of motion and so forth, I should be feeling it in the general area at least that I want to hit. And then when I want to isolate the muscle groups, that's when I start to get a little bit more creative when it comes down to the squeezing or the stretched reps, etc. And you'll also notice that the contracted or the squeezing type reps are only really, or at least mostly effective when the resistance is moving in the opposing direction of the rep. So for instance, if I'm doing tricep like press downs, right? If I'm doing tricep press downs and I'm using a cable machine and the weight is moving in direct opposition to the extension of my elbow, as I stand back from the machine, I'll notice that as I squeeze the triceps, I definitely get a real tricep engagement from that. Whereas if the weight was moving in a different direction, maybe I wouldn't get the same sort of thing, such as in a pressing movement where I'm locking out at top, right? I would not necessarily be getting the same type of stress. And at the same time, if I'm doing close grip bench and I'm locking out at the top and straightening my elbows, that's actually dangerous on the elbows. So there's a time and place to do a contracted rep or a squeezing type rep. And it usually boils down to the fact that when you're locking the joint out, it's never in danger of hyperextension. If you're never in danger of hyperextension, then that might be the time that you could lock out. But if you're standing and doing squats and you want to contract those quads and then you lock the knees out, you might end up looking like an ostrich, right? That's the wrong time to do it. Whereas say you're doing leg extensions, that would be an ideal time to do a squeezed type of rep where you hold at the top at the end of your set in order to get that extra burn. I think you understand my example. But anyway, I hope this helps you out in your training. Thanks a lot for watching. If you need to get a hold of me, just go to naturalgalantbodybuilding.com, and thanks to the Patreon supporters, and take care for now. Mountain. Natural Gallant.